Welcome to the Gritty Podcast. I am your host, Brian Call. Today, folks, I wanted to talk a little bit about some sticky situations I've experienced and then what I know now, how I would handle that, because it's a tragedy when someone gets hurt or dies in the backcountry, and it can happen easily. Water, that's one. The elements, the cold, cliffs, fog, those things can kill you. There's a lot that's back there that can get to you, and most of it is completely avoidable. The old saying goes, panic is what kills in a emergency situation, not so much the conditions. So there's this idea, you're out there, you fall into an icy river, and somehow you're going to get out and start a fire and save yourself. People really emphasize the importance of carrying something to start a fire and light a fire with, and so on. And I've discussed this multiple times on the podcast with different guests, namely John Barklow a few times, because Barklow, who trained a lot of Navy SEALs back in the day on the rewarming drill that the Navy SEALs use, he really has broken down how you survive a situation where you're in those life-threatening conditions. So I'm going to go over that real quick. I've been in that position before, where I have found myself absolutely soaking wet. And basically I did exactly what John covers. So I'm going to read this to you here real quick. This is really easy to happen too, by the way. When I was in Prince of Wales Island years ago, I went down there with my brother-in-law, Travis, and we flew on an airplane, got there, rented a car on the island. We just had what we could fit in our backpack. We drove to a trail, and then we climbed all the way up through the bush. It was miserable up to the alpine meadows up top. Weather was pretty decent on the way in. On the way out, though, it had rained every day for like 7 days straight, like a torrential downpour. The rivers were swollen. They were neck deep. We couldn't find a place to cross. It was rough, and it was getting colder and colder, and all our clothes were wet. And there was a serious chance of getting hypothermic and dying from the elements. So there's different things you can do in that situation. Starting a fire with everything being just soaked in a rainforest like that, pretty tough. What does a guy do? Barklow kind of covers that in the rewarming drill that he did with the Navy SEALs. I've been in other situations. One time I was at 12,000 feet, 12,000 feet one time. And me and my buddy, we were heading to our shelters. But rather than stopping and changing into rain gear, because we knew a storm was coming and it was coming in fast and hard, we sprinted to our shelters. Well, that was a bad idea, because once the fog and the rain hit, it was really tough to find the shelter, and it only took 30 to 60 seconds of that storm to just crash into us for us to get soaked to the bone. I was actually a little less foolish. I ripped my rain jacket out of my backpack and threw it on, and just didn't get pants on, while my buddy just went without anything. And then we had, some puffies and some warmer clothes on, but his was exposed to the rain as we sprinted to the shelters. And, to get to the shelter, we knew what elevation we needed to be at. You didn't have visibility out in front of you, so you couldn't see where you were. But we did know beforehand what elevation our tent was at, and we knew that it was out in front of us. So we climbed to that elevation and we sprinted across at that elevation. Then we ran into the shelters. And knowing the elevation of your shelter, even a GPS point, of course, that would help you. But in the absence of that, having a watch that gave us our elevation and then hitting that and going for it was a very effective way to get back. Nonetheless, though, the rain came in and the storm hit us too quick. I could see it coming. I threw my rain jacket on, and then I went the rest of the way. Well, when we got back to our shelters, we were just soaked to the bone, and it was a potentially deadly situation. We climbed into our tent, and then, for me, I was able to shed my wet pants and climb into my sleeping bag, and boom, within minutes I was totally warm. And then I ended up putting my pants back on so that they would be dry. I had a synthetic sleeping bag, climb into my bag with my pants on, and, opened it a little bit so there'd be some airflow. And sure enough, my pants were dry by morning, even though I had a hard time falling asleep because they were wet. But I didn't really have another option, and I could sleep throughout the night well enough. A little discomfort, but I was able to dry my clothes just by sleeping in that pair of pants. Now, my buddy, he didn't have that option. I mean, his whole top was soaked. Everything was soaked. And the next morning, all his clothes were still wet. And it was, 10 degrees or something. It was very cold, below freezing. And so we ended up having to go below timberline and start a bonfire and dry out all his gear. So there's different ways to handle these life and death situations. They can get bad real fast if you don't know what you're doing. And the issue with all that extreme cold is when hypothermia sets in, the brain doesn't work as well. You lose fine motor skills. So starting a fire starts to be tough. You can't even open a match or strike one. There's a lot to be aware of in these situations. So I'm going to read to you here kind of this rewarming drill. It's really good information. So it goes like this. You fall in, you are soaking wet, like above your head. Everything is soaked to the bone. You're violently shaking. You emerge from super cold water and the wind is ripping. Okay. If you're like most people, you'd probably build a fire, strip off your wet layers, and try to dry them out over the flames. That only works if you can do it fast enough to get a ripping fire going. If hypothermia doesn't set in first, there's a lot of risk associated with that. And that's if you can even start a fire. It says, remember that it's sleeting and the wind is ripping. Even in good weather, you'd be riding that line between dying and burning your gear while exposing your skin to the elements. So not really an option. And when that storm hit us above timberline, it was the same issue. You can't start a fire in those conditions. You didn't even have wood to burn because you're above timberline. So it goes on to say, getting immediately out of the elements and gaining control of the situation is imperative. That's a quote from John Barklow. It says, so here's how John taught the SEALs to handle it. The soaking, shivering troops partnered up, stumbled to their packs, and pulled synthetic insulation layers over the drenched base layers and soft shells. One set up the tent while the other got out the stove to melt snow and heat water. Then both crawled into their tents, into their synthetic sleeping bags, and lied there shivering, waiting for water to boil outside. As soon as they could, they'd sip hot drinks and scoop spoonfuls of rehydrated chili into the quivering mouths and then lie back down. There in the tent, the hot food stoked their metabolism, warmth crept slowly back into their extremities, and they were no longer shivering. After several hours, they were warm and completely comfortable, with dry base layers, slightly damp mid layers, and heavy frost collecting on the exposed sleeves of their puffy jackets. Proof that their clothing was pushing moisture to the exterior. It says it worked because the human body puts out a serious amount of heat. And because the operators were using a carefully chosen combination of moisture-wicking synthetic base layers, warm when wet insulation, not down, and warm when wet sleeping bags, along with ventilated tents, the guys themselves were the heat source that heated the moisture, converting liquid water to water vapor, and each piece worked together to push the expanding vapor out of the system. So you hear us talk about the clothing systems that we use when you're dealing with a high-end performance set of clothing, like the stuff I've been using with Sitka. You're able to wear a base layer that wicks moisture quickly away from your skin. And then when it comes off your skin, your body's got enough heat that it sort of evaporates or pushes that moisture to the next layer. And one of the things that was critical in this case here was basically they were wearing garments that were not down. If you are wearing a insulating layer that's synthetic, a lot of those synthetic layers can get soaking wet and they're still warm even though they're wet. In that sense, it's like wool. Wool has an ability to get soaking wet and then still be warm even though it's wet. It's not comfortable, but it's still warm. That's why wool was used in the military for World War I and II and prior to that and after, because it's such a powerful piece of clothing, because even though it's wet, it's still warm. So synthetic sleeping bags and synthetic puffy jackets, they have that ability to get wet and still be warm. That means they can still insulate, lock in heat and warmth, and even though they're wet. So often we'll talk about whether you should own or use a synthetic puffy or whether you should use a down puffy of some kind. Each of them have their pro and con, but if you're going to be in this kind of situation, sometimes in conditions where it's going to be really wet, I do like the idea of a synthetic insulating garment opposed to a down. And even the water-treated down that is often sold, as much as I like it, It's really only going to keep the down from getting wet from mild dampness. But any kind of intense water and it's shot. And once down is wet, it's useless. There's no warmth to it at all. So it's got its pros and its cons. The pros are that it's super lightweight, it's super comfortable. It breathes really well while also keeping you very, very warm. And the warmth to weight ratio is crazy. But anyway, that's a tangent. That's just talking about the garment. It says it's important to note that the wrong piece of gear would have greatly reduced the system's effectiveness. Since cotton is hydrophilic, cotton boxers would have held moisture and slowed both the drying and the rewarming times. Down also retains moisture, which I just explained, and fails to insulate when wet. So a down puffy or sleeping bag would have made for disastrous results. There you have it. That's why often if I'm going up north or I'm going where I'm getting dropped by a bush plane or a helicopter or chopper or I'm on horseback, it's smart to have synthetic insulated garments instead of some sort of down. That said, I still love to use down in certain hunts for certain conditions. On this, it says, most people don't believe it works. We did it with some industry folks once, and they didn't really believe in this rewarming process. These were the guys developing our military gear. They'd never heard of this before or done anything like it. And it's like, well, how do you know if your stuff even works? All right. So sometimes you don't have a tent necessarily, or the conditions are even worse than they were before. So there's this static rewarming drill, and then they have something called the dynamic rewarming drill. And it goes like this. Similar to the static version, guys cut holes in thick Kodiak ice, treaded water for 12 minutes, climbed out. 12 minutes in icy water. That sucks. I mean, you're going to feel some hypothermia setting in there. It's rough. So they climb out and pull on their synthetic puffy layers. But now, instead of making camp, they had them shoulder their packs and march, moving at a slow, easy pace. Fast enough to generate heat to cook their layers, but not so fast that they'd sweat and create more moisture. Within an hour of walking, their base and mid layers were dry. 2 hours later, when they marched into camp, they pitched tents, unfurled their sleeping bags, and crawled inside, heating water and rehydrating food to stoke their metabolism and complete the drying process. The point of these exercises is knowing what your systems are capable of and gaining experience and confidence in them, knowing that these systems will work. But don't take anybody else's word for it. Try it for yourself. And remember, it doesn't have to be fun to be fun. Great article there. I found this on the Sitka Gear page, experience with Navy SEAL rewarming drill. You know, what's really interesting about this is you can just try this at home and see how it works. You could do it in your backyard, especially if you live in some of these colder climates. Go out on a negative 10 degree day and just jump in there for 5-10 minutes, get out, and then try to survive. It'll teach you a lot of what you're capable of, what your gear is capable of. Maybe you want to try it with one garment, try it with another, and see which one performed better. And these are great things because when you go out and you hunt, one of the things that I'm a big believer in is on some of these high adventure type hunts, you need experience with your gear and with the suffering and the pain and the misery. Because, you know, if I can go back here on the Wasatch, right here behind this studio, and I can climb this mountain with my backpack in the icy snow and go 10 miles back there, come back in the dark, pitch dark with my GPS or my watch or a compass and come back down, okay, under some controlled conditions somewhat, but I still know what it feels like to do that. When I go and I do it in the mountains on a hunt, I've done it before. Like I know what the pain feels like. I know what it's like to hike all night. I know what it's like to move when I'm soaking wet. I kind of know what my limits are. Let's say I go to a gym with a buddy. We go to a CrossFit gym and we hit a workout together. Let's say it's a 30-minute grind, this workout, and it's tough. And each move can wreak havoc on another move. So for example, perhaps it's heavy deadlifts, like a rep of 5 of them, really heavy. And then the next move is a pull-up. It's quite a few reps there. And then the next move is a kettlebell swing. Now, that's a lot of forearm. I mean, you're gripping a heavy barbell. You're gripping for your pull-ups. And then you're doing a kettlebell swing. And your grip can get smoked right off the bat through this workout. And that's the whole point of it, right? So if you've got experience doing this and suffering through these sort of things, like I do, then I might use a hook grip on my lift, or I might pace my deadlifts a little bit, that when I get to the pull-ups, I don't just fail on the bar. Like, having gone through the pain of the actual thing that I'm familiar with, I know how to pace myself so that I can succeed in whatever it is I'm doing. And the same is true with backpacking. It's like, I've done this a lot. I know what kind of load I can carry for how many miles each day in different kind of conditions. I don't just blow myself up in the first hour knowing, what I need to accomplish. That all comes from testing and experience and messing around. I think it's fun too. It would be hugely beneficial for you to know that if you were soaking wet in your gear, in your setup, if you were to get out and the wind was still blowing it, but you were to hike, how hard and how long would you need to hike before you could get warm again? And how long does it take for you to roughly to dry out your clothes in those conditions? When I start moving, my body warms up fast. I'm one of those people that generates a lot of heat from exertion. And so as soon as I stop moving, almost instantly my temperature drops and I can get cold pretty quick. So I tend to leverage my layers a lot. I'll hike in t-shirts and in one layer next to a guy like Ryan Lampers, who's got quite a few more layers on. But if I were to dress like him, I would sweat and soak everything I'm wearing. But as soon as I stop, I got to throw on 2 or 3 layers. And someone like Lampers can just stop and kind of wear what he was already wearing. So because of that, I've learned what works for me and what doesn't. And I kind of know the limits of my own gear too. Also, I don't panic because I've got some experience. My brother and I did the Wim Hof, the Iceman deal, where we would climb into an ice cold lake in the morning and we would sit there for, 5 to 12 minutes or so trying to just stabilize and survive just being cold. I hoped that over time it would be less painful and easier to do it, and I would develop a level of resilience against being cold. Really, no, it just sucked every time. After like 4 months, I still couldn't quite get to where it ever felt good, but it did increase my mental toughness because, man, everything in my being screams about getting out of that ice cold water. Like, everything about it I hate. But 20 minutes after I'm out and I've warmed up, I feel energized. My body feels better. I feel loose. I think there's a lot of benefits from that ice cold submersion for 10 or 15 minutes, but it's so hard to do. And that whole time you're in there, you're just dying. Now, my brother seemed to do better, but I think he has a little more insulation than me, and so it didn't kill him like it killed me. But again, who knows? I can handle heat really well. Put me in a sweltering sauna and I can exercise and run around, and while other guys, they just die. They just melt. But the opposite is true. The cold really gets to me in a way that the heat doesn't. I think Lamper struggles with the heat. Everybody's a little different. Anyway, it's good to get out of your comfort zone, test these things, try these things, see how your gear performs, and know how to handle these situations. So I've been in some nasty situations, some night hikes, some times where I was soaked from head to foot. And as long as I kept moving, I stayed warm. And I know that if I get into trouble, I can just hike. I have a lot of physical endurance and strength, and I can just hike till morning until the sun comes out the next day if I had to stay warm, especially if I have no fire. Moving and hiking, it's got me out of trouble a few times. So, all right, I hope that was helpful. Thanks for tuning in. Like always, remember, save at Mountain Ops using the code GRITTY. Get yourself some blaze shots and so on. Use the code GRITTY at Seek Outside for some shelters and titanium stoves. Use the code GRITTY for you bow hunters at Valkyrie Archery. You get 5% off broadheads and whatnot over there. Heather's Choice, 15% off at Heather's Choice. We got trekking poles. Right now, if you're going to do a bunch of hiking, get some trekking poles from Sissy Sticks and use the code GRITTY. And you'll get a pair at, I think, 15% off as well. All good stuff. Thanks for tuning in. Thanks for supporting the show. And stay gritty.